Our second speaker is Thomas Eriksen, who is again one of the most fertile thinkers in the field of anthropology with respect to nationalism, who's written a whole range of books, including Ethnicity and Nationalism, Common Denominators, Ethnicity, Nation, and the Politics of Compromise in Mauritius, and also Flag, Nation, and Identity in Europe and America. He's written, he's also one of Norway's foremost public intellectuals. A man of great energy, imagination and ambition, and he's going to speak on the grammars of inclusion and exclusion, options for 21st century nations. Thank you.
Would you like Thanks very much. Real pleasure to be here. Important topic. Now that I talk about exclusion and inclusion, we've done a lot of research on this back home regarding minorities in relation not only to the national imagined communities, but also in relation to local communities. But the focus in much of this research has been largely sociological. Right? We've been looking at phenomena such as the labour markets, education, housing, civil society, that sort of thing. So what I'm going to talk about today is not the same thing, but it's something more ephemeral and difficult to study, but no less important than the emotional exclusion and inclusion. Now let me just start with a couple of small ethnographic vignettes, okay? In the 1970s, when I was a boy, we looked up to the Swedes in Norway. We envied the Swedes, okay? Everybody, I mean, we never said this aloud, okay, but everybody really wanted to be Swedish, at least where I lived. So nationalism was not very marked. It was not very marked in the 1970s in Norway. Much less than it was a couple of decades before and a couple of decades afterwards. And in Sweden, I mean, they had a lot of glamour, okay, and among other things, they had some great sportsmen. They had Björn Borg and Ingmar Stenmark, okay, who were the world's best in their respective sports, namely tennis and alpine skiing. Okay? Björn Borg never became a national icon in Sweden, at least not in the 70s and 80s. While Ingmar Stenmark did, he became a symbol of Sweden that many Swedes could identify with. He was uncontroversial and universally admired and loved. How can this be? Because tennis is a much larger sport than alpine skiing, and Björn Borg was arguably, far more famous worldwide than Stenmark. How could that be? I'll give an answer to that later on, okay? Some of you may have the answer already, but I'll give the answer to you later on after I've gone through a number of other things. Now, the other little vignette I'd like to share with you is taken from a newspaper interview in Aftenposten, the largest newspaper back home, 2 or 3 years ago, with Akhtar Chaudhry, who was then vice president of the parliament. I mean, he was really high up, in the formal political system, member of parliament for the Socialist Left Party, where, among other things, he spoke about his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Meccca as a Muslim, okay, a Norwegian of Pakistani origin, and he had travelled with a number of other people in the same situation, that is to say, Norwegian Muslims. Okay, Norwegian citizens, but Muslims by faith, who went on a Hajj to Mecca. And he mentioned in the interview how they had brought with them a Norwegian flag, which is a cross flag, okay? So in the beginning, they only showed it sort of meekly and modestly. They just sort of stuck it out of the window. One of those little flags, on a wooden stick that you see everywhere in the country during national celebrations. So they just stuck it sort of meekly out. I mean, it was rolled up. But then eventually they grew bolder, so they started to unfurl it. So they unfurled it completely and waved this Norwegian cross flag through the streets of Mecca, indicating that they were here and that they were Norwegian. Now these two stories, and that's another sort of vignette that I'm going to have to unpack, okay, but I'll wait a little bit. I'll do it later on. Because I think there is something about the 21st century and nationhood. Obviously, there are continuities, but there are also some discontinuities. And there is something about this 21st century. In a book called Al-Qaeda and What It Means to Be Modern, many people's favourite cultural pessimist, not least here at the LSE, namely John Gray, he ends the book by saying something about human nature and technology. about how human nature is unchanging, but has to relate to and adjust changing technologies. Okay? Now this again, I mean, it shouldn't have been at the end of the book, it should have been at the start of the book, because what does he mean by human nature? He doesn't say. Now, in all justice, it must be added that in a couple of later books he has actually tried to develop his pessimistic view of human nature. But the point is here that there are some invariants in what it means to be human. There are some universals regarding what it means to be human. And those of us who are involved in comparative studies of social life, be it from anthropology, history, politics, or sociology, we somehow have this at the back of our mind. No matter how particular our studies, we have it at the back of our mind. There is something which this particular little study of this particular little place tells us about humanity, about what it means to be human. Durkheim and Mauss knew this, and they put it, in their own way in 1902 in a book called Primitive Classification, where they liken the totemic symbols of Australian tribes with flags. And as a matter of fact, more than half a century later, when the anthropologist Victor Turner did fieldwork among the Ndembu in Zambia, and he was interested in ritual symbols. And I'm going to return to Victor Turner in a little while, in fact, because lots of people refer to Victor Turner when they write about symbols and the significance of symbols. The emotional significance of a symbol, such as a flag, or a ritual, such as a national day. But few people have actually read him, okay? It's just that for a while it seemed as if everybody had read the title of Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities. Right? So I'll go through some of Turner's ideas also if there is time. But the point is that he had an informant more than half a century after Durkheim and Mauss wrote about totemism in Australia from southern Africa among the Ndembu, who said that the milk tree for us, because the milk tree was what Turner would call a multivocal symbol, a symbol that can mean many things. And he said that the milk tree, it's a bit like your flags. It's a bit like your flags. It was an educated informant who'd gone to school, who'd read newspapers. So he knew what a flag was. And he said that, the milk tree is a bit like a flag. So in other words, in a sense confirming, in a way, the view that there are certain dimensions of human nature. That there is, to answer John's comment during his introduction. Yes, there is a need. And maybe there is a need to belong. It may not be universally shared, but it crops up. And it becomes more and more, I would say, more and more a scarce resource. Yes, it has been a scarce resource before, but it becomes a scarce resource in new ways, because there is something peculiar about this 21st century. It is not just that people like Gregory and I speak really fast, Everybody does. The speed of speech has accelerated since the 1950s. And I'm not just making this up. We have measurements which prove that the speed of speech has accelerated. And it's probably accelerated even more during the last decade. I haven't seen the figures for the last decade, but because of, all the new technologies that people have to relate to, everybody is a little bit stressed, Everybody is a little bit, 5 seconds behind. And you never have the time to have a conversation with someone because you have to text your girlfriend, we live in that kind of world. And the world after 1991, I say that, the 21st century started in 1991, okay? On the 17th of January 1991. It started for us Norwegians, because one of the symbols of continuity in Norway was the king, who died on the 17th of January 1991. And he symbolized not just solidarity, but also continuity. And what we're doing with ritual symbols and with large-scale ritual events, such as national days and similar events, is not just to try and stir the soul and instill a sense of solidarity, but also to instill a sense of continuity, that we know where we're coming from and how we got to be where we are. Now, the king died, and it was a nightmare for the newspaper editors, because they'd been looking forward to that headline. But then something of a similar magnitude, seen from the Norwegian perspective, happened exactly on the same day, namely the start of the First Gulf War. Okay? So they had sort of two world events seen from a Norwegian perspective: the death of the king and the start of the First Gulf War. Now, this was an important day for other reasons as well, because it created a situation where all of a sudden the entire nation seemed to go into mourning, which was an odd thing, because the king was an old man, and he had been ill with cancer. He was a chain smoker, he smoked the unfiltered cigarettes, okay? He did a bit of skiing, but not much. He enjoyed his wine and his fags, and he was in his 80s and had been ill for some time, so he was expected to die. But it still created a sense of mourning and a sense of loss. And I believe that at some subliminal, unconscious level, Norwegians were aware that the security and continuity of the industrial post-war era, about which we had so many compelling narratives, how we were brought sort of from agrarian society through industrialism and to the welfare state, how that had been somehow broken off. It had been the bond, the tie with the past had been severed, and we had been thrust into the era of postmodern, neoliberal, globalized, multicultural information society. I mean, I'm not saying that all this happened on one day. You realize what you see what I mean. But that if we want to create a generality for the 21st century, I think we could do worse than choosing 1991. And since then, in the last 20 years or so, we've seen an acceleration of change in many areas. Now, Gregory, you had the Colombian newspaper, okay? I've got the Mexican one. I came to think of that as you spoke of the Colombian newspaper, that in the city of Cancun, there's a newspaper, well, there are several newspapers. None of them are very old, because the city didn't exist 35 years ago. There was nothing. There wasn't even a fishing village. And now it's a city the size of Oslo, 600,000 people. And in this local newspaper, I forgot the name of the newspaper, but I visited the area, Yucatan. Some years ago, there was a rather large article about the identity of Cancun. We have to create an identity, because we don't have one. I mean, people who live there come from all over the place. Some are even foreign, or they come from all over Mexico. So we need an identity. We need to have a local identity. I mean, we don't have it. We've got 500,000 people, and we're doing rather well, because we have tourists who come all year round, but we don't have an identity. So in other words, the point I'm making is that this city had grown from nothing to more than 500,000 in about 30 years. And if you look at urban growth in general, it's massive. You know, in most parts of the world, it's massive. You take a city like Nouakchott in the capital of Mauritania, which was designed by the French in the late 1950s to be an administrative and trade centre for the colonial adventure in West Africa. So it was built with an infrastructure meant to accommodate somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people, okay? And it now has a population of, nobody knows, but maybe a couple of million. Okay, maybe a couple of million. And you could go to Dhaka, which has grown by a factor of 40 in a few decades. A factor of 40. It's grown 40 times. Or you could take Sao Paulo, the traffic in Sao Paulo, where 1,000 new cars enter the roads every day. Okay? And you imagine what it's like to go on a weekend trip out of Sao Paulo on a Friday afternoon during the rush hours. They had the world record in traffic jams, 550 kilometers of traffic jam on an evening. I think it was November 2011. It was measured. And one could go on, exponential growth. Tourism. People already in the late 1970s were complaining about how North European tourism was ruining Spain, because Spain was no longer Spanish as it used to be, because you could get svenska köttbullar, Swedish meatballs, in their restaurants, on the Costa del Sol and so on, and the British pub, with pub food, and so on. But they hadn't even seen, they only seen the beginnings, because in the late 1970s, the total number of tourist arrivals in Spain was less than 15 million. And we're now talking about 60 million. Last year, the global number of international tourist arrivals, it surpassed for the first time in history 1 billion. Okay, 1 billion international tourist arrivals. So we're talking about some fairly steep growth curves. And I don't have the time. And I haven't even mentioned information technology, communication technology, which are the examples most typically invoked when people talk about accelerated exponential change. So in other words, if continuity and solidarity were scarce resources in the 20th century, in a century where, as Zygmunt Bauman puts it, in a bit exaggerated fashion, when everybody is on the move, as he says, the world is on the move. At this time, it is becoming an even more precarious and even more scarce resource, and I guess maybe even in some new ways. So clearly, we need in this kind of society not only to develop new traffic rules to avoid, gridlocks, okay, global gridlocks. I'm now speaking metaphorically, okay? And I've shifted from Sao Paulo to the loftier world of metaphors. but we need the new traffic rules in order to avoid the global traffic jams, gridlocks, and horrible accidents. But we also need new grammars of inclusion. Or you could say entrance tickets into communities, well, be they national or something else, but let's stick to the national now. Entrance tickets into national communities, which are sufficiently inexpensive. Some countries have tried to integrate immigrants through cultural tests. Okay, cultural tests. I mean, you have to pass a test in order to show that you're familiar with the culture. But I mean, it turned out in Denmark, which tried this some years ago, that they tried it, you know. One of the left-of-centre newspapers tried it on ordinary Danes, ethnic Danes, who lived in the country all their lives, and they didn't pass it. Right, so how can you expect the Pakistani who came last year? When was Erlenschläger born, you know? What did Hans Christian Andersen eat for lunch? I mean, we need something else. So perhaps what is needed in order to create a sense of continuity, solidarity, which is the objective here, seen from the perspective of social cohesion. Maybe what we need is something as simple as those icons, those international icons that you typically see at airports, you know, in airports. But maybe they're not thick enough, you know. Maybe they're too thin. But this is a kind of discussion that I'd like to engage with. So we need those. Yes, in order to have belonging, you need those. You need symbols, you need ritual events, and you need something that works. And you need increasingly something that works for people with diverse experiences in a world in turmoil, where there is a lot of fast change. How to create an illusion of continuity in a world with accelerated change. That is the problem. Now, this has never not been a problem. I mean, as John Hutchinson writes about in his book Modern Nationalism, I mean, you've got 3 examples, correct me if I remember wrongly, but there are 3 examples of great post-colonial settler nations which had all at different times decided to celebrate the beginnings of the colony. So you had Canada in 1968, the United States in 1976, the bicentennial, and Australia in 1988. And all of these attempts to create large-scale national rituals that engaged everybody and stirred the souls and instilled the sense of solidarity and continuity, they started to go wrong really very early. You know? Even before they got off the drawing board, they started to go wrong. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't looked at your book for some years, so I might have gotten it wrong. But anyway, I'll take the Australian case, which is the one with which I'm most familiar, just to illustrate what went wrong. The idea was to have one tall ship sailing into Sydney Harbour, symbolising the first fleet, 1788, okay? But it immediately provoked protests. Of course, protests from Aborigines, who would say, you know, what's 200 years to 40,000, okay? And they celebrate, some Aboriginal organisations, in fact, till this day, they celebrate Invasion Day rather than Australia Day, okay? Invasion Day, January 26th. So you had the Aborigines, that was quite clear, you know, they'd simply been forgotten, momentarily forgotten. But then, so they decided, okay, we're going to have a second ship then, representing the Aborigines, so everybody can be happy. And, but then the thing is that there are quite a few million Australians who consider themselves card-carrying Australians and are considered card-carrying Australians, but are not descendants in any way of the people who came on the first fleet. People who are descendants of more recent immigrants. I mean, you have the large South European, the Greek-Italian communities in Melbourne, for example, quite a few Scandinavians, and various other communities who had arrived at later stages, in association with the gold rushes of the mid-19th century. So they also protested. They did not feel that their identity as Australians was sufficiently represented. So in other words, a third ship. Okay? So now when you go to Sydney and you watch the Australia Day celebrations with the fireworks, with rock music and speeches from the politicians, you will see the 3 sort of tall ships sailing majestically into the harbour. In other words, if you cannot find a unifying symbol, you have to settle for the next best thing, a bad compromise. That makes nobody happy, but which at least does not create a major sort of outrage. Okay, so these are the issues with which we deal when we think about national symbolism. How to create a narrative, a dramaturgy, and a set of symbols that can unite people. Durkheim and Morse, of course, did not see this problem. Talking largely, well, they were Durkheimians after all, weren't they? And talking largely about small stateless societies. So their assumption was that the ritual symbols, such as the totems, that they did simply unite people, that they did make people feel the same. And most of the societies with which they dealt in primitive classification were also based on what they called, or what Durkheim called mechanical solidarity. In other words, it was little by way of division of labour, little by way of diversity within the communities. The way they saw it, the way they thought it was, probably there was more. They probably underestimated the diversity even in Australian Aboriginal tribes. But when Victor Turner came and began to write about ritual symbols, in other words, symbols performing some of the same work, okay, as flags and national days do for modern states in a tribal society, in what is now Zambia. He saw this issue, he saw the problem of diversity, the problem of creating an illusion of unity among diverse populations. So even in a tribal society with little internal differentiation, there was this issue of diversity, of problems, which was a problem. Another problem that Turner saw was that, which is also, a chronic problem in nationalism, that of the formal and the informal, as I call it, or the state and society, the state and people. How to produce that hinge which creates a sense of loyalty and belonging to a state, which is an impersonal entity. How to do that? Yeah. Okay, so anyway, Turner, in his work, Among Them and Them, distinguished between two poles of significance, the ideological and the sensory. In other words, the political, that which makes you somehow loyal to the chief and to the powers that be, and the emotional, which is no less important, which had been underestimated by many of his contemporaries among British anthropologists in the 1950s and 60s. And he points out that at the sensory pole, the signs which are being produced are natural or physiological phenomena and processes that arouse desires and feelings. So one single dominant ritual symbol comprises both, as it were, a natural necessity and a social need or desire. It, quote, it represents both the obligatory and the desirable. Here we have an intimate union of the material and the moral, unquote. In other words, the political and the emotional. So that's how they should work. Put differently, ritual symbols are multivocal and can be interpreted in a variety of ways by different people in different situations. And in this ambiguity, as you would know, lies both the persuasive and potentially unifying power of both totemic animals and modern. All right. Modern time. We only got 15 pages left. Don't worry. But so let's move on. That's Turner and his emphasis on the emotional, on the experiential. He coined the term communitas. To the Latin word communitas. He used that in order to describe not the rational aspects of belonging. You vote, you're a citizen. Things which are easy to study for social scientists, okay? Which can be quantified. Are you a citizen or aren't you? And if you are a citizen, you're inside. Well, he knew that, no, it's not enough. Because you have to be emotionally attached to the community, and the rest of the community have to accept you as a part of this. Now, Benedict Anderson also saw this duality if you move on a little bit from the title, okay, and you read the introduction to Imagined Communities, he says, I think it's on page 6, he says that nationalism, in one of the most quoted passages from the book, so I'm not making this up now, and it's not the entire original, but I thought it bears repeating because it resonates really nicely with Victor Turner's earlier analysis of the workings of symbols, how symbols work both politically, instrumentally, and emotionally, okay? And Anderson says in the introduction to Imagined Communities that, nationalism is a bit more like phenomena, it resembles phenomena like kinship and religion more than it resembles ideologies such as liberalism and socialism. In other words, that it's emotional, and it is, as I would put it, a form of metaphorical kinship. Now, I have to move quickly because I'm going to have to return to the little examples I had at the beginning. Okay, I need about half a minute for each of those. But let me add that there is something about national celebrations, and which has probably not been studied enough, and which makes them different from other kinds of ritual celebrations, namely the emphasis on violence and sacrifice. Violence and sacrifice. I mean, in order for the boundaries to be protected effectively, sacrifice is necessary. So if you think about it, even in the very benign and sort of upbeat and positive Norwegian national anthem, there are passages that remind us of the sacrifice made by earlier generations. Now, there are Norwegians in the audience, so correct me if I don't remember the lines. I'm not a very good Norwegian, so I tend to forget these lines, but there's something about slik fedrene har kjempet og mødrene har grett, yes, as the fathers have fought and the mothers have wept. You know, in no uncertain terms, it symbolizes sacrifice. The National Day is the kind of day where you may lay down flowers at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And if you use the tomb of the unknown soldier to grill your sausage, you know, say you're an Australian visiting France, and you say, well, they've got outdoor barbecues here as well. Might as well have a sausage sizzle. You're arrested, and you may be sentenced to, several years in prison. Because it's a sacred, there's something sacred, okay, about the emphasis on sacrifice and on the national days and the national symbolism. It's what makes it perhaps resemble religion the most. Now I have to skip a few pages here. It doesn't really matter. I've said most of what I had to say about the multivocality of symbols, the increased precarity of a sense of solidarity and continuity at a time where there is a lot of turmoil, the continuity with a pre-state world where symbols were used pretty much to the same effect, and the emphasis on sacrifice. And the tension, finally, final thing, okay? I think that was the fifth thing, the tension between what we can call the formal and the informal. Of course, if the state is not legitimate, you'll find your own rituals, your own symbols, which are not connected to the state. In which case the state may, in the long term, have a problem. And this is probably more widespread than many people are aware of, even in countries which apparently are very well integrated. Now there are practices. I'm coming to my examples now, okay, all the little vignettes. There are practices which are associated with appartenance profonde, you know, with deep belonging. For example, in Australia, the barbecue. You know, I mean, if you go out, you put on your sunnies and your shorts and you go and have a barbie. It's okay. It doesn't really matter where you're from. You know, and in Norway, if you go out in nature, in winter, cross-country skiing. In summer, hike in the mountains with a backpack, unshaven. You know, as I tell my immigrant friends, you do that. Take your Norwegian classes. That's okay. Learn the language, but that's not the most important thing. Go out in nature. It melts the hearts of Norwegians. They're never going to object to your religion or your skin color afterwards. So clearly, we have these activities, but these activities are not available to everybody. And this is why I'm saying that maybe what 21st century nations are going to need increasingly are iconographies that resemble the icons of airports, which are still unique and which are sufficiently flexible to be used for many purposes. Now back to my examples very quickly. Ingmar Stenmark was a very quiet man. He never spoke much. He was from the deep forests, northern Sweden, but he was the world's foremost alpine skier. So whenever he was asked on TV or by some journalist, how the hell can you go so fast? Year in, year out, you're the world's best. How do you do it? And he would look at them and say, well, that might not walk. It means, you just go, you just have to go. And he didn't elaborate. He didn't have anything more to say. He was not the showman. So in other words, he was an empty symbol, like an ideal flag that could be filled with different content by different people. So you could approach Ingmar Stenmark from any direction and identify with him, because he had so little by way of substance. Now with Björn Borg, the situation was different. You see what I mean? Like a flag. In other words, a multicultural society could be integrated through a symbol like Ingmar Stenmark, because he in himself represented so little by way of substance, and at the same time a Swedish, so that you could become Swedish by looking at Stenmark. With Borg it was different, because he moved to Monaco, as a tax refugee, okay? And there were stories about fast cars and pretty girls and cocaine, and there were rumors about Björn Borg, which made him controversial, because he had too much of a personality. So people would either defend him or attack him. He could never become a unifying symbol. Too much substance. And the discussion that is being had in some European countries around flags, around the cross flag, go along these lines. Now that a growing part of the population are no longer Christian, can we use the cross flag? Can we have a cross flag which symbolizes Christianity? Wouldn't that be a symbol of exclusion for a growing minority or even majority who don't identify with Christianity? Well, the answer, according to Akhtar Chaudhry, is no. The Pakistani Norwegian politician who happily waved the flag in Mecca. But his use of this multivocal symbol, which like Ingmar Stenmark, like the Ndembu milk tree, that people, when Victor Turner asked people about the milk tree, they would depending on whom he spoke to, they would give him different answers, because it meant different things to different people. But everybody agreed that it was a key symbol in their ritual life. But it meant 10, 15 different things. So similarly with the flag. But Chaudhry also used this multivocal symbol in a multivocal way, because what does it mean for a Pakistani Norwegian Muslim to wave a Norwegian flag in Mecca? Does it mean that world domination is coming, we're taking over Norway as well and turning it into part of the caliphate? That is one interpretation which I've heard. Whereas the opposite and more credible and more obvious interpretation is that we can be we are faithful Muslims, in spite of the fact that we live in that strange, cold, expensive and so on country so far to the north, and in fact comprise the world's northernmost South Asian population. And we can still be Muslim, in spite of the fact that we are culturally different, because the religion unites us. So, and there are other interpretations too that I'm not coming into now, but the point is this, that in the 21st century, if you want to create a sense of solidarity and of continuity, it's going to be hard work, and we're going to have to look for entrance tickets which are not too expensive.
Okay.
Thank you.
The Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism is an interdisciplinary student-led research association founded by research students and academics in 1990 at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We seek to fulfil two broad objectives: to facilitate and maintain an interdisciplinary global network of researchers, academics and other scholars interested in ethnicity and nationalism, and to stimulate, produce and diffuse world-class research on ethnicity and nationalism. We do this through our global membership, our two leading journals, Nations and Nationalism and Studies in Ethnicity and Nationalism, our newsletter, The Ruritanian, which provides key updates on information in the field, and through our programme of events. Our YouTube channel features videos from our annual conferences, seminar series, lectures and debates. You can find us online at lse.ac.uk/ASEN, on Twitter at ASEN Events, or on Facebook at facebook.com/ASEN Events.